water had begun to circle. It did not look like weather, it looked like the lake itself was turning inside out. A muddy whirlpool opened and deepened, dragging trees and a tugboat into its mouth. On the horizon, a drilling platform had listed and slid, vanishing as if a plug had been pulled from the bottom of the lake. Mere hours later, a waterfall thundered where the canal that feeds this lake met an empty basin. This had not been a storm, it had been a hole, drilled where a hole should never have been drilled. On the morning of the 20th of November 1980, Lake Peigneur in Iberia Parish, Louisiana, disappeared. Not over centuries of geological time, not through years of drought. In 3 hours. You see, beneath the lake, the Diamond Crystal Salt Company operated an active mine. Above it, Texaco ran an oil drilling operation from a platform on the water. Early that morning, these two industrial worlds collided when lake water found its way into the mine below. And that was about to lead to a very bad time. You see, as the name of the company might give away, they mined salt, and fresh water and salt don't work too well together. Salt ends up dissolving. The water did that salt rapidly, enlarging what started as a small breach into a mine-wide catastrophe. The pillars that held up the underground chambers thinned, made of salt, weakened, then failed entirely. The miners below and the drilling crew above both knew something was wrong well before the lake began its violent transformation. Men underground reported water where water should never be. The drilling platform started to tilt for reasons that had nothing to do with weather or waves. Remarkably, no one died that day. But the question that investigators would spend months trying to answer was this: what failed first? The drilling plan that put a hole where it shouldn't have been, or the mine's defenses that couldn't withstand what came next? Or both? Let's get into it. Lake Peigneur wasn't much of a lake, covering about 1,000 acres with water that ranged from 4 to 15 feet deep. It was more like a shallow dish sitting atop something else, a massive salt dome. Salt domes are geological oddities. It's a giant pillar of salt formed millions of years ago that bulged upward through the Earth's layers like a slow-motion bubble through honey. The Jefferson Island salt dome beneath Lake Peigneur had been commercially mined since 1919, with Diamond Crystal Salt Company cutting into this underground mountain of salt at multiple levels. 800 feet down, 1,000 feet down, 1,300 feet, and finally 1,500 feet below the surface. The mining method was called room and pillar, which is exactly what it sounds like. Miners would carve out vast rooms, sometimes the size of cathedral halls, while leaving thick pillars of salt to hold up the ceiling. It's a very delicate balance. Take too much salt, leave those pillars too thin, and the whole thing comes crashing down, which isn't good, especially that far underground. The deepest level of 1,500 feet had the largest rooms and the longest spans between pillars. Everything about this system relied on two things: super precise pillar geometry and absolutely dry conditions. Water was the enemy. Like we said, water dissolves salt. Dissolved pillars equals bad day. That morning, 297 employees had reported for work across the mine operations. For them, it was a standard Thursday shift. They knew the lake sat above them, and they also knew that Texaco was drilling for oil from a platform on that lake. What they didn't know, what nobody could quite figure out even later, was how a vertical drill operating from a mapped and measured location would find its way into their underground workplace. That should never have happened. That is exactly why we have those things called maps. On paper, there should have been hundreds of feet of solid salt between that drill bit and the nearest mine gallery. On paper. The trouble on the Texaco drilling rig started before sunrise. At around 4:40 that morning, the drill stuck somewhere between 1,228 and 1,248 feet down. For a drilling crew, a stuck bit isn't all that unusual. Yeah, it's a bit annoying, it's really expensive, but not dangerous per se. They tried the standard fixes, working the bit up and down, adjusting the pressure, pumping heavier drilling mud to stabilize the hole. Then the load gauge spiked past 400,000 pounds. You probably don't know what that means, and you don't need to, but the drillers knew, and it was a rather big problem. By 5:45, the rig itself started making sounds. Popping noises, like metal under stress. The platform then began to list. Not the gentle roll of a floating platform on calm water, but like something was really wrong. Here's what the crew didn't know, but what investigators would later piece together. When you lose circulation in your drilling mud, when your drill gets stuck, it often means you've hit a void. The standard response is to pump heavier mud under pressure to stabilize the gap. But if that void is actually a breach into an active mine gallery, every gallon of drilling fluid you pump makes the problem a whole lot worse. The foreman watched his platform drop 2 to 3 feet on one corner. Not gradually, suddenly, like something beneath had given way. Thinking quickly, he ordered an immediate evacuation. The crew abandoned the platform and made for shore as fast as they could. At 7:25, the drilling platform capsized completely. It was sucked into the water and joined by a tugboat and a string of barges. All of them were being pulled not just down, but into something. While the surface crew scrambled to safety, the lake began its transformation. But at that time, unaware, 55 staff were starting their shift 1,300 feet below. Down in the mine, the first sign of disaster wasn't dramatic, just water where it shouldn't be. Miners working the morning shift noticed it seeping, then trickling, then flowing along the floor of the galleries. In a salt mine, any water is an emergency. This definitely qualified big time. The mine's emergency evacuation plan activated. 4 elevator trips to bring every person up from the depths from 1,500 feet, from 1,300 feet, from all the working levels. By 8:40 to 9 that morning, all personnel had reached the surface. The evacuation procedures, drilled and rehearsed countless times, worked exactly as designed. Not something you hear often on the disaster files. The supervisors didn't just call for evacuation and run. They swept through the lower levels, checking every gallery, every working face for stragglers. They made sure no one was taking a break in some distant corner of the mine, unaware of the water rushing in. This deliberate, methodical evacuation in the face of catastrophic flooding would be the reason this disaster, for all its spectacular destruction, claimed no lives. What those miners left behind was a nightmare of physics and chemistry. Fresh water was eating through the salt pillars that held up thousands of feet of rock. The carefully engineered geometry of rooms and supports was dissolving like a sugar sculpture in the rain. As the mine flooded, air that had filled those massive chambers compressed into smaller and smaller spaces, and that air, well, it had to go somewhere. Later that day, it would find its way out through the mine shafts in violent, explosive vents that shot geysers of mud and water hundreds of feet in the air. But the real spectacle was happening above ground, where Lake Peigneur was demonstrating something that seemed impossible. A lake draining so fast with such force that it would actually reverse the flow of a canal connecting it to the Gulf of Mexico. By late morning, Lake Peigneur had become something out of a disaster film. The whirlpool that started as a disturbance in the water had grown to nearly a quarter-mile across, an absolutely vast churning vortex pulling everything towards its center. The entire lake, all 1,000 acres of it, just disappeared in 3 hours. The suction was so powerful, it didn't just drain the lake, it reversed the Delacambra Canal. Now, this canal normally carried fresh water from Lake Peigneur south to the Gulf of Mexico, but the lake emptied faster than the canal could supply water. So something extraordinary happened. The Gulf started flowing backwards, north into the lake basin. Salt water from the Gulf of Mexico surged up the canal in a reverse flow that would continue for 2 days. Where the canal met the crater that had been Lake Peigneur, the water fell in a temporary waterfall. Some reports put it at 150 feet high, others at 164 feet, oddly specific. Either way, it was briefly the tallest waterfall in Louisiana, fun fact. But that's only because the state doesn't have any other waterfalls, so I guess it was also the shortest, but that sounds less dramatic, doesn't it? Anyway, around 30 shrimp boats that had been moored in the canal found themselves beached as the water level dropped, sitting on mud where hours before they were floating. Local boaters who saw what was happening gunned their engines for shore. Those who made it watched from dry land as the lake drained into the mine. Emergency responders rushed to establish cordons as chunks of shoreline began sliding into the expanding hole. As the whirlpool widened, the land itself began to fail. About 65 acres of shoreline, an area the size of 50 football fields, slumped and slid below the waterline. This wasn't erosion, this was the earth losing its foundation as the sinkhole expanded. Live Oak Gardens, a botanical garden that had been a local landmark, was wrecked. Greenhouses that had stood for decades were demolished in seconds as the ground beneath them simply vanished. Trees that had been hundreds of yards from the water's edge found themselves being dragged into the vortex, their root systems being pulled completely loose. Then, because apparently this wasn't enough, there was the fire. Natural gas from one of Texaco's wells began bubbling up through the chaos. It ignited on the water's surface about 200 feet from shore, burning in patches on what was left of the lake. Parish and state police worked with wildlife officers to evacuate residents from Jefferson Island. They secured the area, setting up roadblocks and cordons to keep people from getting too close to the ground that might collapse without warning. Amazingly, no one was injured in the land subsidence or the fires, but the landscape was permanently changed. The immediate crisis would pass, but a larger question loomed. When investigators arrived to determine what had caused this catastrophe, would they be able to give a definitive answer? Or would the evidence, like the lake itself, have disappeared into the earth? The Mine Safety and Health Administration arrived while the lake was still draining. Their investigation would take 9 months, from November 1980 to August 1981, and their conclusion would satisfy almost no one. MSHA evaluated 3 possible scenarios. First, the drilling operation had penetrated directly into or dangerously close to mined-out rooms. Second, the mine itself had experienced structural deformation that brought it into contact with the drill. Third, some combination of both factors had created the perfect conditions for catastrophe. After months of analysis, interviews, and reconstruction, they reached their verdict. They couldn't say for certain what had happened. The official report named no single precise cause. When investigators cross-checked surveys, they found something odd. The drill site appeared to lay within a mined-out area of the 1,300-foot level. But the key word there is appeared. With the mine flooded, structure collapsed, and much of the physical evidence was destroyed. What investigators could explain was the mechanism of destruction, what they called the Swiss cheese problem. And if you're a regular viewer of this channel, you will be familiar with that. Once fresh water found any path into the salt mine, whether through a direct breach or a near miss that weakened the structure, dissolution would rapidly enlarge that opening. A hole the width of a drill bit could become a torrent in minutes, a catastrophic inflow in hours. The salt would dissolve, the passages would widen, and no human intervention could stop it. The regulatory response had been textbook. First, ensure safety, done well with 0 fatalities. Then secure the site and begin gathering what data remained. By the 30th of November, just 10 days after the disaster, the emergency operation had officially ended. The lake was refilling with salt water from the Gulf. The fires were out. The land had stopped sliding. But if government investigators couldn't definitively assign blame, if they couldn't point to one party and say, "You caused this," how could the courts handle it? How could Diamond Crystal Salt Company, Texaco, and the other affected parties resolve questions of liability worth millions of dollars? Without definitive cause from investigators, the courts were left to sort out the mess through civil litigation. By 1983, the parties had reached settlements, though even the amounts remained disputed in different accounts. Contemporary news reports put the figures at $32 million from the drillers to the miners, and then the miners and the drillers paying $12.8 million to Live Oak Gardens for their destroyed botanical display. It was messy. Later retellings cite $45 million to Diamond Crystal. The inconsistency in these figures decades later reflects the broader ambiguity around the entire incident. Even the accounting remains unclear. What these settlements represented was civil compromise, not criminal conviction. No single party was officially branded the villain. No government agency pointed to one company and said, "You did this." Instead, insurance companies, lawyers, and corporations worked out who would pay whom and how much without anyone formally admitting fault. The mechanism was purely financial. Write checks large enough to make lawsuits go away, but without the clarity of a jury verdict or a regulatory finding that would definitively assign blame. And also probably the reason why there is so much ambiguity in the figures. Notably absent from these settlements were the workers. The miners and the mill employees who'd evacuated that November morning, who'd lost their workplace to the flood, weren't part of the civil agreements. When the mine permanently closed 6 years later in 1986, those job losses weren't covered by the millions changing hands between corporations. So there was accountability, measured in millions of dollars, flowing between insurance companies and corporate accounts. But there was no smoking gun, no single point of failure that investigators could point to and say, "This is what went wrong and this is who's responsible." Lake Peigneur should have changed everything about how industries share underground spaces. In some ways, it did. In others, we're still learning the same lessons. The most obvious fix is what's called a one-map policy. Before anyone drills anywhere, every company operating in that space, miners, drillers, storage operators, all must reconcile their surveys, put all the maps on the same table, use the same coordinate system. The second lesson is to treat salt dome boundaries as fuzzy and not fixed. These aren't sharp edges drawn by nature, they're zones of transition, and they shift. Any safety calculation needs conservative distances, extra clearance between where you think the dome ends and where you start drilling. Let there be room to be wrong. The third lesson, and this one worked perfectly at Lake Peigneur, is that emergency planning saves lives. Those mine evacuation drills, the procedures that seemed routine and repetitive, were the reason 50 miners went home to their families that day. We're still learning these lessons because in 2012, another Louisiana salt dome at Bayou Corn failed. That sinkhole formed years after mining had ended, swallowing acres of swampland and forcing evacuations that lasted years and not days. It showed that these underground spaces can fail long after the last worker has left. For the communities living above these domes, memory is long. They remember 1980. They know about 2012. Trust depends on transparent monitoring, on companies and regulators sharing data, on everyone involved remembering that beneath the ground, different industries are sharing the same fragile space. Today, Lake Peigneur is quiet. If you didn't know its history, you'd never guess that this placid body of water was the site of one of the most bizarre industrial accidents in American history. But there are clues if you know where to look. The lake is different now. Brackish instead of fresh, its ecosystem forever changed by those 2 days of Gulf water rushing in. And it's deep. Before November 20th, 1980, the deepest spot in Lake Peigneur was maybe 15 feet. Now it plunges to around 200 feet, making it the deepest lake in Louisiana. That depth wasn't carved by geological time or gradual erosion. It was created in 3 hours by human error. The drilling platforms are long gone. The mine entrances are sealed, flooded, irretrievable. Live Oak Gardens was rebuilt, though it was never quite the same. The canal flows in its proper direction, south to the Gulf. Lake Peigneur stands as a peculiar moment, a disaster that through preparation and sheer luck killed no one. 50 miners evacuated safely. Drilling crews abandoned ship in time. Residents moved back from collapsing shorelines. In the catalogue of industrial accidents, it is nearly unique. Spectacular devastation with 0 fatalities. Thank you for watching.